Hey, welcome everybody to our third of a academic year 2021 series, Brown Bag series, sponsored by the Institute for American Indian Education here at the University of New Mexico. I'm Glenabelle Martinez, and I am going to be the discussant for this session, and I would like to get started right away. We're going to have a very fascinating discussion by Professor Delores Greyeyes and Professor Wendy Greyeyes, mother and daughter team. And they are going to lead us into a very important discussion looking at the criminal system, the criminal justice system, its effects on education, and looking at restorative justice and a number of important issues. So with no further ado, I will go ahead and give this over to Wendy or to Delores to start the conversation.
So thank you, Dr. Glenabelle Martinez and the Institute of American Indian Education, Brianna Fragua and Wendy Gayton. So the idea for the brown bag originated with Brianna, and I just want to send a shout out to her for inspiring our faculty to present and create this venue for an exchange of ideas. So as Dr. Martinez explained, I do have the great honor and privilege of co-presenting this paper with my mom, Dr. Delores Greyeyes. So Mom, do you want to start with your introduction first?
I'm originally from the Black Mesa community where the old Peabody coal mining, where the nation got a lot of its resources for many, many years. But I been working for the nation probably a little close to 40 years. And a lot of my background has been in social work. About 18 years ago, I switched over to public safety and have been there as their director of corrections. So I work here in Window Rock part-time and then spend half of the other time in Kayenta. So that's me.
Thank you, Mom. So I am currently an assistant professor in the Native American Studies Department at University of New Mexico. But so as you can see, my mom and I started this project in 2018, which really started from her dissertation. So for today's presentation, our title is the Navajo Nation Policy on School Discipline, an urgent call for Navajo tribal policy reform. And this is really that next step for my mom's dissertation, but we thought together that we would work on this project together. So this is where it's evolved. But so in our presentation today, we're going to cover 3 areas. One is the purpose for the call for reform, and then the case for the reform, and then we'll do the call for reform, like how we imagine that reform to look like on the ground within the Navajo Nation. But I'll go ahead and let my mom kick it off, starting with the opening.
So a lot of my interest in this, as I stated, really came out of the work that I'm doing and trying to understand how we had such a high population of Navajo people coming through our system. And so some of the research I found was that there were policies, school educational policies that made it lightly for students to face, become involved in the criminal justice system, starting with the juvenile court. And in some cases, while they're in foster care. So, and there's a recent phenomenon called the School-to-Prison Pipeline, which was developed because of some of the research that was happening across the United States, which was finding individuals ending up in the prison system because of educational policies. And a lot of the Native American Indian students were ending up in prison, starting out with local detention centers and so forth, just because of some of the problems that they were having at home, their resources, special needs, violence in the family, and substance abuse, which led to criminal activity in the home in the community. And this coupled with the zero tolerance policies in the schools, when a student messed up, didn't come to school, the policy were applied without really any involvement of the parents or the students in why this was happening, or what maybe their thoughts on what might help them in getting through. Like one of the things that we talked about was the peacemaking strategies, getting the family involved. So that's the theory in the pipeline to prison. So if we can go to the next slide, I'll do an overview of the study that I did. So as part of my PhD dissertation, I decided to take a look at strictly Navajos and trying to understand how they ended up in the prison system. And so I did interviews, individual interviews, as well as focus groups, and which allowed the Navajo, young Navajo men to reflect on their stories as young children, what their educational experiences were, and of course, discipline at home and at school. And as they interface, when they interface with the criminal justice system, what it was like, and any recommendations that they might have to educators, leaders in their community. What would they have loved to see happen when they first, when our young students are running into problems at schools? And it was really interesting to hear a lot of their perspectives. The other thing that that I found out is that this is really the first study focusing on Navajos only. They were made a part of data collection that were done in the Phoenix areas and other areas across the country, but never just on Navajos. So a couple of findings here. One of the things that we found, or I found, was that the school had the most powerful impacts on inmates' lives as it relates to family, communities, and other institutions. A lot of the memories of how school was mostly negative. And of course, there were some positive experiences that they had. But again, when we talk about school and the age of this population, most of them were boarding schools. And so the negative experiences really was physical, harsh punishment, physical punishments, verbal assaults, abuse by teachers, administrators. And I mean, to the point that one of the young men says that his teacher told him that, you're just not a no good Indian. You're just going to end up in jail or dead. These are the kind of things that were forcibly said to our children. And of course, there were some positives in which if they got attention, let's say if they were having problems with math, they seemed to thrive on that. They talked about that as well. And the other interesting thing is that these the participants talked about their involvement in sports. They were the best in basketball, wrestling, anything that had physical contact where they can express their violence. That was really interesting. And that's really sometimes what kept them in school. And the only reason most of the time that they went to school was because everybody else was doing it and they had to, and pretty much there was nothing else to do at home. So that was the first finding. The second finding was that the teachers and principals were identified to be one of the very powerful forces contributing to the negative experiences, and often because they were not supportive, accusing them of bad behavior, being disruptive, and then which led, of course, to absences, inattentiveness, and then fighting with teachers or peers and so forth. The principal had the authority, of course, to suspend or expel the students from school. So very powerful as far as what happened to our kids. And one of the major reasons for discipline was due to fighting. But of course, the fighting started out because of just the abuses that were occurring or the non-attention. And this is national data that we were able to pull, and that I also took a look at. And one of the things I found was that our Native American people were #1 in the prison system across the United States, as well as in Alaska. And this is looking at both the federal prison and the state prisons. And we were having an earlier discussion with Nanaba and Glenaba, and one of the things that she was talking about is that in New Mexico, we have a really high Native American juveniles in the state system. When Russell Begay was the president, one of the things he learned and brought home was that 40% of the juveniles in the New Mexico systems were Navajo. So interesting data.
Taking all of this research and the data points that were identified by my mom, I figure, okay, so what are we gonna do next? One thing that my mom had presented is, in terms of her research, is that she did ask the inmates what type of educational reform would they like to see. And they felt that there wasn't enough input and exertion from the Navajo Nation leaders to actually identify and be stronger advocates for them. So in terms of thinking about what was happening, not just from the stories of the men that my mom interviewed for her dissertation, we also decided, okay, let's look at what the data says now. And so it prompted us to look at school disciplinary data for the Navajo Nation. So in this slide, there is an unbelievable abundance of data reported for school districts. So in this case, we looked at the civil rights, data collection with the US Department of Education. Their graphics do a really great job of capturing the out-of-school suspensions. But on the Navajo Nation, there are 11 school districts in Arizona, 2 school districts in New Mexico, 1 school district in Utah. And there is approximately 32,000 students enrolled in the K-12 public school systems. In this study, we did not include the Bureau of Indian Education, which has approximately 15,000 students. But in terms of many of our Navajo students, many of them attend public schools. So overall, in this graph, we show that the data reveals that 5 to 25% of all students who have received 1 or more out-of-school suspension by district. So when you look at the data and on these charts, we also thought about, okay, which school district has the lowest? And we found that Window Rock down here had the lowest percentage suspended. The highest percentage was in Red Mesa, Pinon, and Cedar Unified School District, which had the highest suspensions. And this is just in 1 year. So, you know, in terms of thinking about this analysis, we do recognize that we have to do more of a deeper dive in terms of the longitudinal element of the data. But in our paper, we do break out also the specifics to students with disability. And this is the next slide, which shows those students with disabilities and those types of disciplinary action taken against them. So, and if you do read any of the School-to-Prison Pipeline, they spend a significant amount of time talking about students with disability and students without disability. So, and there have been moves on the congressional level to actually address these systematic issues of making sure that the treatment towards students with disabilities have certain rights and due processes in place prior to getting disciplined. But in general, you know, our paper does do a deeper dive in terms of thinking about that process. But ultimately, when we do look at all the states combined within the Navajo Nation, Arizona leads the 2 states, New Mexico and Utah, in terms of the number of disciplinary action against students attending schools on the Navajo Nation. But this section is really just to provide our case, to show leadership, to show the Navajo Nation Board of Education, to make and help people understand the depth of the issue within the Navajo Nation with data. So the point is to show in terms of discipline that as we move forward, as my mom had pointed out in the literature, that there is a strong relationship theoretically in terms of the school policy and its impact, students' impact on the path of increasing impact on their incarceration. So there is a lot of that linkage that is being described. So in this next slide, we also wanted to kind of theorize a little bit about discipline on the Navajo Nation. Really, the question is, when did the Navajo Nation give up their right to discipline their own members? And obviously, we traced it back to the 1868 Navajo Treaty. In the treaty, it states that the Navajo Nation, in terms of entering this peace treaty and returning from Huelti back to our homelands, that any wrongdoer would be given to the United States to be tried and punished according to the laws. There were no age criteria set or the specificity that we have it now, but as you may have observed in the earlier literature, we did talk a little bit about how did this theory arise in terms of the school-to-prison pipeline. And one of the theories that was stated is that this is a recent phenomena that's happening throughout the United States. It's been over 30 years since schools have actually strengthened their school policies to actually become not zero tolerant to issues within their communities. So one place where the treaty has become more refined is actually the Navajo Nation Tribal Code. I'll let my mom go ahead and describe this.
Okay, I did also serve on the Navajo Nation Board of Education for 4 years. And one of the things that I learned, and one of the things that I wanted to see happen, but, because the nation itself is so bureaucratic, we were never able to get to where we wanted to go. But in 2005, the nation amended its code to begin to give power back to the local community. But part of the education reform was to give power and authority back to the local communities and the parents. And they provided a written code of student conduct, rights, and their responsibilities, what it will be. But the thing that's wrong with the law is that it only covers a segment of the BIE schools. And so the nation doesn't have authority over its public schools and some of the other BIA schools that are still under the BIA control. So the limitation really limits the nation and what it's able to do with its students as far as developing policies and monitoring. And this includes the disciplinary actions that are occurring within the school. So if we have only control of a small number of schools, then the data is really something, the way when Wendy presented it, what's happening to a lot of our children. And so one of the ideas in further reform and tribal action is begin to take a look at what the nation can do in monitoring what's happening with its children across the board, across all school districts on the nation, and getting parents involved and at this earliest stage as possible. And one of the things that the inmates talked about was that when I asked them, what do you think should have happened to help you to better yourself in education, to prevent you from being here? And one of the things they said, I wish that my teacher would have talked to me. I wish that my counselor would have found somebody else like a medicine man, or brought my parents in to be part of the discussion of what was happening to me. because, you know, a lot of what happened at home really impacted what was happening at school. And what was happening at school, if let's say if they were disciplined at school and they were unhappy, then they go home and then the impact is there again. And with the high rates of substance abuse and then just really pure lack of resources, it just really got the kids out on the streets, and they got into trouble and running into problems. And so I think the education system is really a start. And in my dissertation, I talked about the idea of getting the peacemaking program, the counselors into the school system early on to work with our kids, involving the parents and so forth. And they talked about it. Some of the prisoners talked about learning to pray until they actually got into the prison system. And some of the things that they said, I wish I would have learned this, along with having to write, along with learning to do math, biology, whatever the school offered. I wish that my culture would have been included. I think I would have used that. And in some cases, one of the inmates said, you know, I would like to go back into my community. How can I help? Maybe I can talk to the kids. Maybe I can tell them what I went through. Maybe I can tell them that these are available to you. And these are things, I think, reasons that it's that time again to make some changes in our tribal law to address the needs of our children. Our children are out there screaming, help, help. So do you want to add anything, Wendy? Since you did a lot of work in this area too.
Why we had the education code is to give you guys an example of how much the Navajo Nation has still given up its power, its oversight, its authority to other external parties. And here in red, it states that the student code must be consistent with applicable Navajo Nation federal and state laws. Well, this is kind of that irony where it's like this spin cycle in which the applicable Navajo Nation law is this. So when we think about trying to find and identify exactly where does the Navajo Nation have the power to ensure that it's protecting its students, but also empowering the teachers and the principals to have the tools and the resources to find a different way to create restorative justice within the school systems. And there's no real demons or deviant actors here. We're not blaming one person. We're saying that the system and the rules, the way it's structured right now, really doesn't work in favor of our Navajo students. And so this prompted our decision to look at, well, what exactly are these federal and state laws? So this began our research in terms of part 2 of my mom's dissertation, but this is kind of that action element, is we looked at public school policies. We looked at about 20 school policies for both Arizona public schools and New Mexico public schools. And we coded them as we read through for the similarities and differences across these school policies. You know, as we thought about, you know, some of the similarities, we did find that many of these school policies are purchased kind of the cookie cutter, you know, uniform codes that are built into the infrastructure, but each are catered to each school system. So, you know, definitely there's a lot of companies out there that build these policies, and that was such a powerful revelation in terms of what we uncovered. But what we did is we went through and coded these through a software called Atlas TI to find those similarities and differences. One limit that we do recognize in our study is that we did not include Utah public schools and that we did not include Bureau of Indian Education schools. So that's a real big hindrance in terms of thinking about this project. But what do we find in terms of that? You know, so when we went through the policy review in this project, generally we did find that education rules are very rigid. So even when you glance at either an Arizona or New Mexico school policy, it's very evident that our parents, our Diné parents, our Diné community members did not have a role in developing these cold and rigid and unforgiving rules. And that these were really designed by state education agencies, their school board members, or excuse me, their state board of education members, their legislative bodies. I mean, there's a lot of processes in terms of thinking about where do these rules come from that the Navajo Nation believes is the critical set of rules that they'll allow our students to have to abide by. So as we recognize, you know, when you look at the financial data of schools, education is big business and billions of dollars are on the line for schools. So this is why they invest into these rigid school policies. So when we did dig in specifically, we also did find that nearly $500 million of revenue each year is shared with the nation to operate over 144 schools. And these include the public, the charter schools, the federally operated, the tribally controlled schools, and the parochial schools overall. But in terms of the findings, I'm kind of letting you guys do the reading as I articulate this. But one other finding is that clearly there was no pathways or alternatives that reflect the Navajo restorative justice system. So in terms of coming to a clear understanding, much of the meaning of discipline is pretty standardized across those policies that we read. But these designations define the disciplinary action. You can see that the teacher plays and the principal plays a really significant role in defining students' behavior and defining it as disruptive or breaking rules within a school system. So, you know, there's a lot of those specificities that, you know, when we work when schools have to define that, they really have a lot of flexibility in defining it at the local level. But in terms of the law in which they have to adhere to, there's a short-term and long-term response in terms of discipline. And then the most extreme is the expulsion. So we wanted to make sure that, you know, when we were writing this paper that we thought about some of those elements as well. But when we looked also at the school stuff, the school policies, we also thought a lot about what are the rights of students right now within the system that exists. Students are given this right called due process. And it kind of harkens to, you know, our constitutional Bill of Rights, the United States Constitutional Rule of Rights, is that we can't deprive anyone of life, liberty, or property. So, you know, it's funny to see that language kind of trickle down into the school policies. But the requirement of due process is that a student has the opportunity to be heard before they're suspended or expelled. And you can see that the school really plays both, you know, the judge, the executioner. I mean, you know, it's within their own structure and institution. And so, you know, that's one area that we thought, okay, if we're going to amend the education code for the Navajo Nation, you know, this is one area of modification. The other thing is the expectations that are imposed upon parents and students is that they have a sufficient understanding of due process, meaning that they understand the law, you know. And as you guys know, many of our Navajo students do not have access to attorneys. They don't have access to a lot of these resources. And so when we think about refining this policy and building our case for the urgent call to action, we wanted to also make sure that we tackle some of those issues. But ultimately, we did find some areas where this could be refined and revisited. So let's see. So this is the last part of our presentation, and this is our urgent call. And I'll go ahead and let my mom close this out with this ending.
Taking some of the recommendations that the inmates shared, and then having served on the Navajo Nation Board of Education, I really gave this some thought, and again, getting somebody involved early on, like a mediator, a peacemaker, to help reach a resolution between the teacher and the students, and making sure that the student is given an opportunity to speak. And one of the other things that they brought out, the inmates, as I was interviewing them, some of them said they were scared, you know, sometimes even just to speak to a teacher or a principal. Anything they said was used against them. And the other thing that I didn't bring out was that when they put resource officers into the school system, they were immediately taken to a detention center, from the school to the detention, particularly if there were other behaviors that they had a history of interrupting schools and so forth. So the superintendent and the administrator they should be trained either in peacemaking, restorative justice, or hire someone. You know, we have a lot of elders that are wanting to work in the school system. And one of the things my mom did years ago was that she worked in the school system. And this was the former Bureau of Indian Education. And my mom served as a dorm mother, and she weaved, and she was there for kids. And just basically, I remember dorm mates sending students that were girls. I was in the girls' dorm, so they would get to go talk to my mom if the dorm aides thought that they were in trouble or getting into trouble for various things. And I found that when they built that relationship with my mom, just the talking relationship, they seemed to turn themselves around, and they knew where to go when they felt something was happening not so well with them. And then schools should be able to provide a list of resources, mediators, and this could be obtained from, you know, the courts, local social services. And a lot of these services are at no cost. They're federally funded, so there should not be any reason for our children not to get these services within the schools. The other thing too is that the Navajo Nation district courts, they have the peacemaking program that have some excellent training. They talk about peacemaking. They talk about how peacemaking is applied using the traditional values and the 4 directions. And I myself have sat in on some and actually did learn some things. And it really brings you to thinking about applying discipline. And schools should be able to provide attorneys to students to help them get them through their due process, as opposed to just applying the disciplines and students end up out on the streets. And they should be able to choose their own attorneys as well. And so I think an implementation of this is identify best practices for Navajo schools, and really try to focus on lowering the suspension, expulsion, and that should be the last resort. And I'm not saying that, you know, the answers lied with these guys that were sitting in state prison, but I think they shared some good ideas looking back, what could have helped them. And again, in my work that I do, a lot of these guys are not just guys and gals, are high school dropouts. We offer them general education, and they do really well. Some of them are very interested in Bible studies. You know, those are very popular as well. So I think that, you know, providing them structure has really brought them around. But then when we send them home, they have no place to go. But I think we need to do the intervention very, very early on within the school system. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Greyeyes and Dr. Greyeyes. This was definitely an eye-opening, fully informed presentation. And I appreciate Dr. Delores Greyeyes. I appreciate you for all your work. It really comes from my heart here that you put so much of your life into this work as a social worker, as a mother, as a community member, as a granddaughter, daughter, but also in terms of your research, listening to those individuals who are part of this process. So I want to thank you, Ta'a, Ta'a on Dutawai. Thank you, sister, for doing this. This is beautiful for your work. So I guess I'd like to, I have some questions, but I want to start off with just a couple of comments that are in the chat box. All right, so Jerry Cronin has 2 comments in there, and I don't know, Wendy Senior, you might want to take a look at that, but his first one was posted at 1:28, and he asked the question, when does the Navajo Nation plan to assume control over its schools and educational systems? He writes a comment, the obvious starting point would be to develop one major public law 92-638 contract. It doesn't break the BIE's grip completely, but it does empower local school boards. So would you like to comment on that one? His question, when does the Navajo Nation plan to assume control over its schools / educational system?
Tomorrow.
It should have been yesterday, though.
Should have been yesterday.
It should have been in 1973 when Dylan Platero, the first division director, actually imagined creating and transferring all the Bureau of Indian Affairs roles and responsibility from across the street in Window Rock, across Morgan Avenue, and transferred to the Education Center. But that project's been in the works since 1973. So, and just recently it's kind of reared its head up again. And right now, all of those decisions are in the hands of the current acting superintendent, Patricia Ghani, and the current Navajo Nation Board of Education. So there is a contract, there has been public hearings, everything's been put together in a nice document. And so it's really now up to the Navajo Nation to make those moves. But in terms of thinking about the Title 10, Navajo Nation already has control over its local school boards. When we highlighted the education law, they do have the ability to ensure that school policies have local community input. But those are just the tribally controlled schools. And right now, those policies, I don't have access to those, so I don't have the ability to analyze those. But right now, the story that we're trying to show is that majority of our Navajo kids are in public schools. Navajo Nation has no authority over those public schools. Those schools are managed by state education agencies, and all these rules that are being defined are established by state board of educations. And here in New Mexico, I guess they call it the Public Education Commission. So, so there's a lot of differences between those entities, but in terms of the 638 contracting process, that would only impact about 10% of the total Navajo Nation student body.
Thank you. Let's go to the next question. Again, it was again by Jerry Cronin. He writes, the fundamental starting place is that the local governing board is supposed to approve the policy handbooks, not if they are BIE. The BIE has its own chain of command that excludes the local board, so it is the ELO ADD who has the authority. How can you even begin this self-serving, how can you even begin until this self-serving structure is changed?
So that's where as you stated, the answer is in your earlier question, 638, because those BIE schools are still managed by the federal government. The Navajo Nation doesn't have authority over those. And as you said, the education line officers, which I think are the education resource centers, And the education program administrators, the EPAs, are the ones who really have full decision making. Although BIE schools do have school boards, they don't have decision making power. They only have advising power over those school systems. But again, this presentation is really more about the public school side, the story that of the larger impact of where our students receive their education.
Danelle, would you like to ask your question? Ms. Yazzie?
I didn't realize that the presentation would cover so much of what we're trying to do here at our school. We've actually been emphasizing the changes within our own discipline structure and trying to reformat and reform our own discipline practices. So it's nice to see that there's research behind it supporting what we're trying to do from a Navajo standpoint, because I think that's something that's definitely missing in our area because, you know, our population is so small. We never have enough research focusing on individual tribal nations, and it's just really nice to see that. I think I was just wondering, how have you guys reached out to peacemakers as far as asking for training or asking the courts to increase the amount of peacemakers they have? I know here in Shiprock, our peacemaker services, there's one peacemaker that's been very consistent, and she services the entire Shiprock area, the northern agency. And that's all the way from Dithna-Odithli to Anith, and then down south to Newcomb, Nashchidi area. So I just didn't know if there was any talks or if you've heard of anything in terms of Navajo Nation government of increasing the amount of peacemakers that they're hiring or increasing the budget for that.
I'll take that question. Unfortunately, many of the tribal programs that are operated by the nation are funded through the federal government. And so the number of peacemakers is dictated by the funding level that Madam Chief Justice Jane gets in hiring. But, you know, there are alternatives. So we have a lot of our elders out in our community. There are medicine people that actually can come into the school system and become that mediator, because the mediation really uses our cultural teaching, the talking out. Our own Navajo Nation Council talks about nabikiyatiki. So that's the form in which they use to discuss any issues before moving it forward to the Navajo Nation Council. So really the same concept. So really the school district could actually budget for mediators and traditional counselors to do the peacemaking in the school system.
It's a very good question.
Thank you.
Yeah, very good question, answer. Okay, I guess I have a question here, and this is for Dr. Delores Greyeyes. You spoke eloquently about the prisoners and how obviously you had a really good relationship. As a qualitative researcher, I do this kind of research, so obviously you had developed a really good trusting relationship with them, and you know, you weren't somebody from externally, you know, you work within the system. They know you, you're a familiar face to them. And I was wondering if you talk a little bit about, you talked about how the prisoners would have appreciated more connection between the schools and the families when there were disciplinary measures being taken. That if there had been connection, that they had wished that there had been more efforts by the schools to bring their family in or bring the community into that. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit more, either maybe talk about some of the things that what the prisoners were thinking about specifically, or if you want to comment on that idea about what they would have wanted for themselves as students.
So the population that I studied or worked with was the Winslow State Prison. Obviously, I couldn't do the study within the Navajo Nation government because the Navajo Nation system, because I'm directing and overseeing that system. So when I did ask them the question about, what their involvement, what they would like to have seen, again, is being able to be asked, what's wrong? What's going on with you? How can we help? Maybe bringing their parents in to be part of their discussion. Because again, like I said, there were things going on external to the school at home that was become troubling for them within the school system. And so, and then some were just lacking resources. They didn't have money to buy a nice pair of jeans, a shirt. They see their peers with really nice to date name brand gear that they wear. And so they were kind of shy and didn't have the money to buy the same kind of stuff that their peers had. But they would have loved to, the response was, we would have loved to have a medicine man come in and teach us about our culture, teach us, like I said earlier in my presentation, even the basic prayer in Navajo. Why did they pray in the way that they do? How did they do it? Why is it important? What is the role of the fireplace? What is the role of water? What is the role of Mother Earth and Father Sky and things like that? A lot of it, they were saying they learned in the prison system when they had a traditional counselor come into their facility and do some work with them. And they were saying, it seems so easy that I could have done better in school with the support of this individual coming in. Just being able to talk to somebody, maybe something happened last night that they can't talk to their parents at home. They were, to the point of physical, and one of them talked about sexual abuse on the bus. Can you imagine that this individual wanted to talk to somebody? In our own culture, there are ceremonies and there are prayers that can be done to help heal, help the healing processes for the individual. And my relationship really was built through just being able to sit with them when, and they volunteered. So I sent in kind of a synopsis of my research, and I was looking for volunteers. And when I got my volunteer group, I actually met with them in a group setting. The prison actually accommodated us by providing like snacks and so forth, because our Navajo traditional culture, that's what's provided when you come to a meeting, when somebody comes to visit you, you provide some type of refreshment. And, I just talked with them and introduced my clan, where I'm from, the kind of work that I did, and just sort of just be that person. And I think at some point they related to me like I was their mom,
Yes.
Shema.
Yeah.
And by clan, I think one of them called me Shema son, and that was good. That was fine. And I wanted to take this a step further, but the prison system wouldn't allow me. I wanted to be able to provide a traditional meal. I wanted to do like a corn mush, bowl of mutton stew and fried bread, and bring it in one day. I even offered to have, they had problems with food coming into the system. So I said, well, if you can order the ingredients, I can work with your cooks, and we can have everybody, the entire prison, have that meal that day. I still couldn't get that approved. So, but at least they knew that I tried. And so every time I went in, I spent a good summer there, going in every day for several weeks and just spending time with them. And the other thing that they liked is that I was able to sit down with them individually and talk to them openly And I didn't have a uniform. I didn't have a radio. I had nothing of what an officer would wear. So they could relate to me and talk to me. And I think I was so thankful for my experience in social work, the many years that I spent working with Navajo families. And I think that that skill really helped me to bring them out as well. And so it was an exciting time. It was hard to leave. They were sad. I was sad when I did my last session with them.
Yeah.
And well, one of the things that they did also tell me is that you are the safest place in this prison system, in this room with us. And that meant a lot to me.
Yes. Yeah, that's, you know, I'm really glad you're speaking to this, Delores, because that's the humanitarian part of doing research as Indigenous peoples. We just don't go in and collect the data and we're out of there. You know, like I told you, I work with kids, Native American kids who are incarcerated at the 2 state facilities here. And I remember one time when we have a prayer, I told the kids, I said, you know, I carry with you in my heart when I go to different places. I wonder how he would feel. I wonder how she would see this, because they become part of you, you know, and that's important, because, you know, they're our relatives, you know, they're not, they're our relatives. And so that's good that you did that. Well, it looks like the chat line the lines are burning up here. We have only like 6 minutes left here. So you know what I'm going to do is, Wendy Senior, do you want to look through that list of questions and see which one you would like to respond to?
I actually think there was a really good one from a comment from Danielle Lansing.
Okay.
You know, I thought this was a really fascinating one too. And she says that, you know, when we think about the high numbers of out of school suspension in Pinon, Red Mesa, and Window she says, I can't help but think about the very rural nature of Pinon and Red Mesa. And she's right. You know, Navajo Nation is so big, and it's so, there's so many different variations in our town structures. I mean, some of our towns are as big as cities. So I think for Danielle's statement, that I'm completely intrigued by that too. Why is Window Rock, why do they have less suspensions versus Pinon and Red Mesa? And you know that there's still gaps in this research. But as Danielle Yazzie stated, there's just not enough research out there. There's not enough information. There's not enough data. There's not enough knowledge to help us, one, convince lobbyists, legislators, our own tribal people with the data and the facts to make these changes. Because we're looking at it from a top level, and the school board is, you know, in that local community level. So when you have to look at a lot of school initiatives and school efforts, a lot of it's really top down, and we're especially seeing it right now with COVID and the schools being reopened in February here in New Mexico. So there's a lot of issues that we have to think about, but in terms of empowering schools and teachers so that they know that the rules and the laws are situated for them, to give them the resources to help our students, because we know teachers and principals and school board members go into this career not for the money, but because they care about the students. And I really think they get cornered, just as we saw in Pinon and Red Mesa, due to the lack of resources. And they're only going to use the best resources available. And this is not a knock on my mom, and I love her, but you know, there's a lot of money out there for correctional facilities to be built. And that's come a long way. You know, in the past, there wasn't good facilities there, but there's a lot of things that happen and that build up to actually create the situations that we have now. And because we're in this conversation, having this dialogue, we can make those changes. We can convince our tribal leaders to make this change. And, you know, and when I see my mom have a lot of this emotion, it's sad, because you do see a lot of these men and women who are in these tribal jails, and they're your family members. And you just think, where in the education system, where did things go wrong? And I think we should be spending a lot of our time trying to give alternative opportunities for students and these inmates. And although we're looking at it from the tail end and then working backwards, I think it's really important that we start to reconceptualize a whole different Navajo education system. And I apologize to my Pueblo and Apache colleagues, but I think, I think we can maybe model an idea of how to do this, but I think just the vastness of the Navajo Nation, it gets so bureaucratic and redundant. And I think moving forward, we need to think about how to restructure that. And this is just one of those items that we need to revise in our Navajo education system. So this is kind of where that's coming from, but I really appreciate Dr. Danielle Lansing, who is kind of at our sister school at SIPI. So that I just want to address that a little bit, but I know there's a lot of questions, so I'll leave it to you to determine how we can. Dr. Martinez.
Well, actually, I think the time has come to an end for the session. It's 2 o'clock.
Okay.
So, I think that there is so much here that I would really like to see a follow-up on this. And maybe the two of you can present at the Indigenous Education Research Conference, which is going to be on April 22nd, I believe it's a Thursday. I should have the date too now. Anyway, but maybe you can present there. And I hope all of you will tune in to our next brown bag, as well as maybe join us with the Indigenous Education Research Conference. Thank you, Dr. Delores Greyeyes. Thank you for all your work. Thank you, Wendy, Wendy Senior, for all your work. It's beautiful what you do, and I just hope that we continue to do stuff. And I wish everybody who is here today, thank you very much. And I send you many blessings, love. Thank you for your work, and I hope all of you are safe. And we will come out of this situation we're in right now. So thank you very much.
Thank you.